Hello, this is Susanna from Hold It Right There Sewing Patterns. Welcome back to my video tutorial series for making my sewing pattern, the Vignette Phone Crossbody bag. This sewing pattern is available for purchase on my website linked below. In this video, I will walk through the steps for creating the flap and installing the snap. Follow along now on page 4, step 3 of your sewing pattern instructions. Locate your flap E pieces. Choose one of the flap E pieces on which you will mark the snap insertion point. For a magnetic snap, you want to mark the side of the flap that will be facing the interior. Set the other flap piece aside and, using a fabric pen, mark the snap insertion point indicated on the pattern piece. I will now cover installing a heavy-duty snap in steps 4 through 9. If you are using a magnetic snap, skip ahead to steps 10 through 14. Pin or clip flap E right sides together. Sew along the sides and bottom edge using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Do not sew across the top. Trim the seam allowances close to the stitching, and I particularly clip the corners so that I can push those out. Then, once you've trimmed the seam allowances, turn the flap right side out and give it a good press. Insert the medium stabilizer into the flap through the top opening. I am using Decaville Light for my stabilizer, and while it is fusible, I prefer not to fuse the stabilizer. I find that fusing it can cause some wrinkling. Top stitch the flap along the side and bottom edges using an 1/8 inch seam allowance. We will now insert one of the 1 inch square stabilizer pieces through the top opening of the flap, and I find it helpful to use a drop of fabric glue to keep the stabilizer square in place. Place the stabilizer square on the wrong side of the flap, directly behind the snap placement marking. The stabilizer square is now sandwiched between the two flap pieces. Using a leather hole punch or a seam ripper, punch out or cut the snap placement marking. Be sure that you cut all the way through the layers of fabric, interfacing, and stabilizer. And the hole needs to be large enough for the stem of the snap cap to pass through. You will now need the heavy-duty snap parts for the flap. These are the anvil with the smooth side facing up, the cap, the socket, and the metal tool. You will also need a hammer and a sturdy surface to work on, such as a hard floor. Insert the cap through the hole in the flap. You should see the cap on the outside or exterior facing side of the flap and the cap stem poking through the hole shown on the inside facing side of the flap. Flip the flap over so that you see the stem and rest the cap in the smooth side of the anvil. Place the socket on top of the cap stem. Be sure the cup side of the socket is facing upward. Working on a flat, steady surface like I am or a hard floor, fit the metal tool into the socket. Hammer the metal tool firmly several times until the cap and socket are securely connected. The heavy-duty snap is now installed in the flap, and you are ready to continue on to page 5, step 15. I will now walk through steps 10 through 14 on page 5 for installing the magnetic snap. Locate the magnetic snap and its washers. Take the male half of the snap and set the female half aside. The female half will be installed later in the slip pocket in step 30. Center the magnetic snap washer on the insertion point marking on flap E. Use a fabric pen or marking pencil to trace the left and right prong placement lines. With the sharp point of a seam ripper, carefully cut through the prong placement lines. Be sure to cut through all layers of fabric and interfacing. To prevent the incision edges from unraveling, apply a few drops of liquid fabric sealant, such as Dritz Fray Check. Allow to dry before moving on to the next step. Locate the two 1 inch ultra firm stabilizer squares. Place a magnetic snap washer on one of the ultra firm stabilizer squares and trace the left and right prong placement lines with your fabric marker. And repeat on the second one, again tracing the prong placement lines. Using the sharp point of a seam ripper, carefully cut through the left and right prong placement lines on both of the stabilizer squares. Working from the right side of the marked flap, push the pronged feet of the male magnetic snap half through the prepared incisions in the flap and into one of the ultra-firm stabilizer squares. The second ultra-firm stabilizer square will be used later with the female magnetic snap half. Insert the snap prongs through the holes in the washer, then fold the prongs outward to secure. We will need both flap pieces now, the side with the magnetic snap and your exterior facing side. My exterior, I put a little tag on it. Pin or clip the flap right sides together. I did fuse a scrap of woven interfacing over top of the prongs of both my magnetic snap and my tag, and that's just to protect the fabric. Sew along the sides and bottom edge using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Do not sew across the top edge. Trim the seam allowances close to the stitching, and I particularly trim the corner edges. And once you've trimmed, then turn the flap right side out. I'm using an old letter opener to push out the corners in the flap. You can also use a blunt pair of scissors or a chopstick, anything just to get the corners as sharp as possible. I've given the flap a good press, and now I am going to insert the medium stabilizer into the flap through the top opening. I am using Decaville Light as my stabilizer, and even though it is fusible, I am not going to fuse it. I find that it gives wrinkles if I fuse it to the flap. Top stitch along the side and bottom edges using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. The magnetic snap is now installed in the flap. You are ready to continue on to page 5, step 15. Locate the D-ring tabs F and place them wrong side up. Fold in and press the raw edges over the interfacing toward the center. You will do this with both of the D-ring tabs. Using a 1/8 inch seam allowance, top stitch both long sides of both of your D-ring tabs. Insert the D-ring tab through the D-ring. Fold in half, matching the raw edges. The right side of the fabric should be showing. Repeat with the remaining D-ring tab and D-ring. Locate the prepared flap E. Be sure that you have the exterior side facing up. Align the raw edges of the D-ring tabs at the top edge of the flap. Then pin or clip the D-ring tabs even with the left and the right sides of the flap. Sew using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Flip the flap wrong side up and mark the top center with a fabric pen or marking pencil. So just to be clear, this center marking is on the interior side of the flap. This marking will be important later in the bag construction. Your flap is completely finished, and this concludes our video. Join me in video 4 as we create the exterior for your Vignette Phone Crossbody bag. Thanks for watching. Happy sewing!